Despite taking horrendous losses of vehicles like tanks, Putin is still finding ways to produce the modern means of making war. How has Russia managed to survive the worst effects of the sanctions, or simply avoid them entirely? In the days after Russia invaded Ukraine, it rapidly became the most sanctioned country in the world. There are now more sanctions in place on Russia than there are even on North Korea or Iran. Over 18,700 sanctions exist on Russian individuals and entities. In contrast, there are about 5,000 on Iran, and a little fewer than 2,200 on North Korea. The sanctions plunged Russia's economy into recession in 2022, when it shrank by a little over 2% for the year. The Russian economy then rebounded. It grew by 3% in the first 3 quarters of 2023, exiting the recession and ending many hopes that sanctions would cripple Russia's ability to wage war. In a statement of this grim reality, it began with Russia subjecting Ukraine to the largest air raid of the war so far. 158 missiles and drones were part of this attack. Ukraine claimed that it shot 114 of these weapons down, but the increased bombardments in December 2023 and January 24 were more reminders that many Western hopes had been dashed. A year earlier, as the tempo of missile attacks on Ukrainian cities slowed, some observers believed that Russia would run out of its advanced long-range missiles. That hasn't happened. Even after suffering significant losses, particularly in terms of vehicles such as tanks, Russia continues to find avenues for modernizing its military capabilities. Here's how. The West demonstrated a high degree of unity during the first days of the war, when it sanctioned a broad range of Russian industries and individuals. One of the most important examples occurred when Russia was removed from the SWIFT banking system. This system is a messaging network that financial institutions use to send and receive information on an accurate and rapid basis. The SWIFT system does not store any money, but does ensure rapid transfers. For example, if a person in Japan needs to receive money from another person in Brazil, the sending bank will use the SWIFT system to message the receiving bank, which will use the information and credit the money to the receiving party, while debiting it from the sender. Before SWIFT, banks used the telex system for international exchanges, but it was slow and insecure. Enter SWIFT in 1973, which by November 2022 had more than 11,000 member institutions spanning over 200 countries or territories. The central banks of 10 countries – Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States – oversee the system. So it was comparatively easy to sanction Russian banks from accessing it, as these are all nations that steadfastly oppose the invasion. Another blow to the Russian economy came in the form of sanctions on its energy sector, which is by far Moscow's most important source of revenue. On December 5, 2022, the G7 and European Union put a price cap of $60 per barrel on the Russian oil that would be exported with the assistance of shipping firms from those states or organizations. By late 2023, the price cap had at least partially succeeded in its objective. An analysis by the Kyiv School of Economics estimated that Russia's earnings on oil exports were 30% lower in the first months of 2023 compared to the same period in 2022. The EU's embargo on Russian oil also played a role. The profitability on Russian oil has declined in other ways. Because of the price cap, insurance firms are now charging extra to underwrite Russian oil shipments. Russian tankers must now also travel greater distances than they used to in order to make their deliveries. However, Russia has begun to adapt to these sanctions. It's purchased over 110 tankers of its own to try and produce a sanctions-proof fleet. The result is that 65% of Russia's oil shipments are now done outside the purview of the price cap. More importantly, Russia has improved relations and deepened its economic ties with other countries since the war in Ukraine. Countries which are not as committed to economically isolate Russia. China, India, and Turkey are all not parties to the price cap, and now import 80% of the oil that Russia exports. Russia's increased trading relationship with China has been particularly important in weathering the storm of Western sanctions. Between January and November 2023, bilateral trade between the strategic partners reached $218.2 billion, more than the total for 2022. Chinese shipments to Russia in November 23 also rose 34% from the previous year. Russia has become a major importer of Chinese automobiles. In turn, China has been a vital customer for Russian energy exports. In 2022, revenues to Russia from daily energy sales to China averaged $210 million. This figure declined to $178 million in the first half of 2023, but that was largely due to lower global prices for Russian oil. In total, China purchased about $30 billion worth of Russian energy between January and June 2023. In the aftermath of the invasion, India purchased more Russian energy than it did before. In the second quarter of 2022, Russian oil in Indian markets rose to 14% of the share, compared to 0.5% in 2021. By June 2022, India was importing 950,000 barrels of Russian oil per day. Just between May and June 2022, India's imports of Russian oil rose by 15.5%. The surge in demand from Indian oil refineries came partly because of a discount following the decline in Western demand for Russian oil and other energy products. By the first half of 2023, India was Moscow's third largest customer, importing about $15 billion worth of Russian energy products in the first half of 2023. Turkey also accounted for a good deal of Russia's energy exports. It was the fourth largest customer over the same period, with a little over $10 billion in total imports. By August 2022, Turkey had doubled its imports of Russian oil, jumping from 98,000 to over 200,000 versus the same period in 2021. Turkey did not sanction Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, even though it does consider the so-called special military operation to be a formal war and prohibited Russian naval ships from crossing the Dardanelles and Bosporus. Despite all the talk, the European Union was still the second largest customer for Russian energy exports by the first half of 2023, with a little less than $20 billion of total imports in the first half of 2023. However, this revenue has declined by 90% from levels seen before the invasion. The sanctions from the West therefore allowed Russia to diversify its energy market. In some ways, the move paid off. By April 2023, Russia's oil exports had recovered to where they were before the war began, and in September 2023, Russia brought in $7.6 billion in energy revenues, up 7% from the same month the year before. Rising oil prices and new customers allowed Russia to at least make up enough of the financial shortfall from the loss of Western customers to maintain its war effort for the long term. Russia is now less dependent on selling its energy to one bulk customer, the European Union, and has improved its economic and energy ties with more like-minded countries. On the cruder level, Russia has also adopted North Korean tactics to evade economic sanctions. For example, one such tactic is to illegally turn off the transponders of commercial ships. Doing so allows these vessels to conceal where they are. These ships then do covert ship-to-ship transfers of their goods, effectively laundering the origin of the merchandise and its route. The Russian oil fleet has also sent fake signals to aid in it evading sanctions. In a similar tactic, Russia uses civilian companies to conceal the ultimate destination of its imports. Once in Russian territory, these imports will then be diverted from the civilian companies to the military ones. Russia has also displayed a level of cunning in escaping the sanctions on high-tech equipment and establishing alternate supply chains. The sanctions put on Russia in response to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 acted as a dress rehearsal for the Kremlin, allowing it to prepare for what would come later. Russia's leadership sought new paths to attain imports in the face of such sanctions. Moscow also prioritized local industrial capacity to produce the parts and machine tools it would need for its military. By the time of the invasion, Russia had a plan in place to weather the storm of the coming sanctions and to tap into the new routes it tried to develop. Alternate supply chain routes include imports through friendly third countries like Iran, the former Soviet states in Central Asia, which straddle a land route between China and Russia. There is even an important network through the Balkan countries of Europe. As 2022 turned into 2023, the Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure waned. International observers were hopeful that it meant Moscow's stockpile of these weapons was being depleted. After all, these missiles required advanced electronic components to manufacture. Sanctions on these components, such as the semiconductors made in Taiwan, were seen as a big blow to the Russian war machine. The day after the invasion, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, announced that it would halt all export of its products to Russia, in compliance with Taipei's joining the sanctions regime against Moscow. TSMC is by far the world's largest semiconductor maker, with 52.9% of the global market share in the second quarter of 2021. Since these chips are critical components of modern precision weapons, it was hoped that this would ensure that Russia could no longer manufacture its most advanced equipment. These sanctions were supposed to be particularly crippling, given that Russia has no domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity to speak of. The computer chip capacity that Russia does have still relies heavily on Western parts. American companies like Texas Instruments, Intel, and AMD, meanwhile, would also no longer supply chips to Russia. However, Russia has found ways to skirt these sanctions too. Through middlemen based in countries like China and Turkey, Russian imports of chips hit a record level by the fall of 2022. $2.6 billion worth of computer and electronic components had entered the country by the end of October, with $777 million worth made by companies in the United States and Germany. In a small number of cases, exports of these technological components to Russia continued directly from the European Union. While Washington has prohibited the export of chip technology and parts to certain companies, others have stepped in to fill the void. For example, the United States banned exports to a Russian company called GK Radiant, a Moscow-based computer chip and electronics distributor. Exports to that company plummeted, but a new company called Titan Micro has since established itself on the same floor of the same building. Titan Micro has imported $9.9 million worth of electronic components between April and October 2022. One of its suppliers was a Chinese company called Sino Electronics Co. Limited, which was sanctioned by the United States for supplying Russia's military. Sino Electronics has itself evaded the American sanctions and has remained a supplier for Titan Macro. Although the Western sanctions on computer chips have hurt the Russian war effort, imports from China can mitigate the worst effects, as the latter exported 90% of the global chip supply between March and December 2022. China's position at the center of the supply chain has been critical in allowing Russia to gain the American and European technologies that have been forbidden to it by the direct route. Middlemen have also been an important supplier of other war gear to Russia. China has declined to give Russia full-fledged military support, which has been a source of tension between Putin and Xi Jinping. However, Chinese companies have provided Russia with parts to manufacture weapons. The proof came in the form of renewed missile strikes. It's now clear that Russia will not run out of missiles. By May 2023, Russia renewed the mass attacks on Ukrainian cities. Russia launched 34 Iskander and Kinzhal missiles in an attempt to destroy the Patriot missile defense battery it had received earlier, but the latter intercepted 100% of these projectiles. Although these attacks failed, Russia demonstrated its continuing capability to bring missiles to the fight. It did so again on June 10th, when Russia hit a Ukrainian airbase in Poltava with 8 ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. Attacks continued throughout the summer. The new year began with the most intense missile attack of the war. It is true that the missile-to-drone ratio in these air raids has grown increasingly lopsided in favor of the latter. In April 2023, 40% of the long-range projectiles fired at Ukrainian targets consisted of Iranian-made Shahed 136 drones. Afterward, the number had increased to 60%. Nevertheless, that 40% number for cruise and ballistic missiles is still a large one, and Russia left little doubt that it could still use its missile forces to effect as the year came to an end. In May, Ukrainian intelligence assessed that Russia could produce 60 cruise missiles, 5 Iskander ballistic missiles, and 2 hypersonic Kinzhal missiles per month, and capture projectiles have confirmed that these weapons are made with Western electronic components. For other weapon systems, Chinese supplies have helped to fill the void left by Western sanctions. By April 2023, Ukrainian military sources reported that they were finding an increased amount of Chinese components in the Russian weapons they were encountering. These components include the aforementioned electronics, but also other equipment. Ukraine once had a relative advantage in drone warfare. But as 2023 started to wind down, Russia had gained more and more of an edge in the preponderance of equipment like FPV drones. Ukrainian troops have captured Russian drones and found them using Chinese components to power the navigational system. These drones had earlier used Swiss components. Chinese parts have also been discovered in fire control systems of Russian tanks, which had once used French parts. When Reuters inquired to the Chinese Foreign Ministry about these allegations, the latter said that it valued normal trade cooperation between all countries and that it had been prudent and responsible with regard to the export of military items. Some of the exports from China are of finished products. By the summer of 2023, Russian customers had purchased hundreds of thousands of Chinese ballistic vests, while drones capable of dropping ordnance were also popular items, as were thermal sights for night fighting. Russia had imported over $100 million worth of drones from China in the first half of 2023 and $225 million worth of ceramics, a critical component in the modern body armor that Russian troops have often lacked thanks to corruption and organizational incompetence in their domestic supply chain. In contrast, China sold only $5 million of such ceramics to Ukraine over the same period. China has skirted retaliation for helping Russia to evade sanctions by billing these sales as being of dual-use technology. As the name suggests, this is technology that can have both civilian and military uses. This legal ambiguity and the fact that much of the manufacturing supply chain is in China effectively leaves Beijing free to support its strategic partner while still avoiding Western retaliation for helping it to break the sanctions regime. Beijing has sanctioned a domestic company called Comnav Technology for selling radar and navigational equipment, which could be used to support Russian missiles and Iranian Shahed drones, but this seems mainly for symbolic purposes. The Chinese leadership has often overlooked the practices of its domestic companies. As the holder of the world's reserve currency, the United States could combat this by imposing a ban on dollar-denominated transactions with these items, but it has so far not done so. Even if it did, an increasing amount of trade between China and Russia is being done with Chinese currency, and there is little doubt that they would evade such sanctions in this way at some point. With such support in place, and with its practices in evading sanctions on its own, Russia has had a wartime production boom that gets less attention than it should in Western media. Russia has lost thousands of its best tanks on the battlefields of Ukraine, but in 2023, it still partially replaced its lost fleet, producing 1,530 new tanks, 2,518 infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, 1,400 rocket artillery vehicles, 12,000 automotive vehicles, and over 22,000 drones. According to Russia's TASS news agency, the country's aerospace forces had received 237 planes and helicopters, 86 new anti-aircraft weapons, and 67 radar stations in 2023. Russia even managed to nearly finish the building of 4 additional Tu-160M strategic bombers for its nuclear forces. Defense Minister Shoigu claimed that the new inventory also allowed an increase of training flight time to cadets by 20%. The Russian Ministry of Defense also claimed that it had achieved an 84% sufficiency rate in producing this equipment. Although these newly produced weapons are not as high in quality as they had been before the sanctions, they are good enough, and Russia is making enough of them to keep itself in the fight, despite a high attrition rate. Russia is also able to rely on its partners to supply it with weapons. In the first days of 2024, the Biden administration announced that Russia had used North Korean short-range ballistic missiles in attacks against multiple Ukrainian targets. In November, South Korean intelligence had warned that North Korea has been supplying Russia with such missiles as part of the arms deal the two countries had struck in the autumn of 2023. According to John Kirby, the Biden White House's national security spokesman, the North Korean missiles, which were used in late December and early January, had a range of 900 kilometers. The graphic Kirby released appeared to show North Korea's KN-23 and KN-24 missiles. These are solid-fueled projectiles, which means that they can be easily launched and transported. These missiles were first tested in 2019. Kirby also added that Russia may have plans in place to purchase additional missile systems from Iran. The North Korean and Iranian examples illustrate the weaknesses inherent in the sanctions on Russia. These countries have long been under heavy international sanctions, and yet their missile programs have continued. Russia's improved relations with these countries since the invasion has given it supplies and the knowledge on how to evade the sanctions that would otherwise imperil the production of its most important weapons. Although Russia has generally prosecuted the war with incompetence on the battlefield and in its military command and organization, it's proven far more resilient than many Western experts hoped it would be. Now, in the face of Ukraine's unsuccessful 2023 offensive in Zaporizhia, the relative decline in Western military aid to Kyiv, and Russia showing initiative in the eastern theater of the war, Western experts and leaders have had to reassess their options. In early 2023, Western leaders quietly admitted that Ukraine would likely not recover all of its pre-war territory. This assessment must be stronger now, and Russia's resilience in the face of the extensive sanctions is part of the reason. International sanctions may have slowed the Russian war machine, but they seem incapable of acting as a decisive factor that stops it. Do you agree? Is there a way to make the sanctions on Russia more effective? How will Russia continue to adapt its economy and industry to get around them? Don't forget to let us know in the comments, and make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.